and I can also build upon what you said when it comes to regulators. Ultimately, you mentioned this as well, that several times regulators and governments will step into the arena as well, for the simple reason that they need to protect the interests of their citizens, right?
Yeah.
And the best example of this is what is happening those days in Bangladesh, where Mr. Brahman, the so-called the green banker, the governor of the central bank has actually has reforced the banks to create a new payment systems, a rural payment systems for the people who do not have access to anything, with the only difference that the central bank will propose its guarantee to those deposits, which is making a very strong difference to what is happening in other countries. So the central bank will be there really to protecting the interests of citizens.
Yeah. So you're concerned about risk. Let's tackle that. About in some of these countries where there's non-traditional players, short of what is happening in Bangladesh, you're worried that some of these non-traditional players could be adding risk to the system, particularly if there's a problem and suddenly there's no regulation, there's no rules to really dictate what happens.
For me, there are clearly risks that belongs to the sphere, right, which is about protecting the interest of the ones actually that have the deposit and bank accounts and all that. But you have also many of the risks that belongs to the way that those services will be proposed to the end customers, with the technology that stands behind this, the networking side, cybercrime. I mean, it's fine to take about, like we have 212 countries in the world and 11,000 institutions. But you need to making sure that all of that is actually really secured, right? And you can read in the press, right? Go every day in the press, you see leakings, right? You see, every other day 30 million there, 45 million there that are being basically stolen by people that have a specialty, especially if you're coming from some countries, to hacking and getting into the system. So if you're not proposing a system to the people that is really secured from a protections point of view to the people, but also from a technology and access point of view, you're going to have some issues.
But I would say that regulators...
That sounds a bit like an argument of an incumbent, though.
Well, let's say, without risk, there's no reward, right? Certainly. So ultimately, I think there may be another obligation for regulators, which is, are these new technologies, are these disruptions net positive for industry, for individuals, consumers? And I think if we had the burden of not just protection, but of actually creating value, then I think we should see some risk, managed risk, that can keep the robust or unfragile system in place, but has to let new opportunities emerge.
That I couldn't possibly disagree with that statement, but that debate will oscillate. There will be moments in time, just like financial deregulation, derivative deregulation, where everybody thinks distribution of risk is great and it's creating engines, to power economies, and leverage is safe because we're much smarter. We have, great PhDs from MIT working on this stuff. And then instantaneously overnight, it's too big to fail, moral hazard, banks are too big, financial leverage is too concentrated, it's too concentrated on the one hand, it's too distributed on the other hand because we can't find it.
So should we mediate the oscillation and try to make it smaller then? Or?
I mean, look, atoms vibrate since the Big Bang, and I think the conversations that are policy-driven will vibrate, just as long as atoms vibrate. So I don't think that there's a way to stabilize that conversation. I think that there'll be some trial and error, but I think what I would argue for, and I think there seems to be like at least some part of the room that feels this way, is that as these interfering technologies or new sticky ways to access financial services, transaction, start to look more like sources of financial risk, financial exposure, where governments might be expected implicitly to underwrite that risk over time, people are going to start paying attention. And the moment you have a crisis, people are really going to start paying attention. Yeah. So I don't think that it's impossible to foresee that.
Partha.
Let me just give you a contra view. We tried to say whether we should apply for the new banking regulation, new bank we were to apply for in India. And then we did this calculation saying I have to keep so much money for SLR, which is, keeping money with the government and doing this. And for the next 10 years, we probably will make lesser money than we will make as a non-NBFC that we are, a non-banking financial institution. So this is all is happening because of the regulation which wants to protect. If you overlay the regulations to all the people who are holding money, and they are asked to prescribe to the same thing, then the attractiveness that is in from a financial standpoint will come down dramatically. Then the rubber will actually hit the road. And then they will say whether specialization wins the game in that era, or it is going to be these people who will try to manage both the selling as well as keeping money intact
So-
is going to win. It's going to be an important factor. And I think so far as the regulation is not there and only convenience is there, it's fine. But the moment you overlay regulation, and they have to manage all that regulation, which is one of the biggest problems that any bank faces, how to manage these regulations and be on the right side always. So I think it's an important consideration.
That's a good point. Oki, you're predicting this fight over regulation and more of it, and won't it slow things down then?
I have a new idea.
Okay.
So maybe the regulators, governments, may or should let banks do everything.
Everything.
I mean, so far, the regulators have been very protective, protecting banks, so that the banks cannot do, the merchandising or, gaming, those kind of things. Let banks to do that.
To get into gaming.
Gaming or Amazon type of business, whatever, and the banks has got the
banks get
capital.
bigger and bigger then.
Yeah, so that's another way to somehow balance the
Right.
the situation.
So as Amazon brings the fight to the banks, then they should bring it back.
Well, look, it's a little late to put new panelists on, but if we had a retailer, if we had a telecom company, if we had a technology-oriented platform representative here, my guess, I don't know, but my guess is that they don't necessarily want to be banks. They're thinking about offering financial services as a way to make their telecom or their device business much more attractive. Or they're thinking of financial access as a way to power their retail or their merchandise. In the same way that, we represent financial entities here. I don't think any of us want to necessarily become telecom companies or become, merchandisers, even if we had the opportunity, because again, there's a natural skill set or core culture, corporate culture and customer base that makes sense for us to, expand and cultivate. But it may not be that smart. Just as a for-profit enterprise to try to branch too far.
But it's not only services. There are so much of settlements, payment, happening in those, Amazon or those places, and they are paying, or their clients are paying a lots of fee to banks. So if they take all things,
fair enough,
inside, then they make a lot of money.
I think you're identifying the nature of convergence. What's happening there?
Yeah.
I'd love to.
It was once said that there's two ways to make money: bundling and unbundling.
I'd love to open up this discussion to the audience. If any of you have questions, we could go on.
Disagreement.
Yes.
My name is Max Neukirchen. I'm the head of strategy at JP. Microphone, please. My question is actually, what do you see as the impact of virtual currencies on payments, such as Bitcoin and others? Do you see this as just a flash in the pan, or is this there to stay?
Thank you. Anyone want to grab that?
I would say I am a huge believer in cryptocurrencies, not just for transactions and not necessarily just Bitcoin, but I think the invention of the open ledger with the blockchain is fundamentally really technically exciting. And I think whether it is for transaction of value or whether it is for traceability of digital assets, I think this invention is going to affect financial services, not just on the transaction side and the settlement side, but also on the capital formation side too.
Yeah. I think, I do believe that Bitcoin and those kind of things are very good. But again, the government will step in. For example, this is what I think. The U.S. government, the biggest treasury, biggest government in the world, they do love greenbacks, dollar cash. You know why? Those, they print money, and once those money go to the, weapon business or drug business, wherever, those money will never come back to treasury. So it's like a debt equity swap, right? So they issue paper as a debt. Now it will become equity. So if the digital cash take over the real cash, then the U.S. government cannot enjoy those kind of things. Okay, so I believe the government, like the U.S. government and the big government, will step in to somehow stop to those digital cash to become
But
too
so is
large.
it stop or regulate? So I think there's an opportunity to regulate this technology, as is already happening in many jurisdictions, but I don't think you can stop it.
China tried to stop it.
Actually, 70% of transaction volumes in Bitcoin's exchange are RMB denominated, so it's not being stopped.
So this is not an area of expertise at all, but if I think in a parallel old-fashioned universe where if there's an independent Scotland, we don't even know exactly how to think intelligently about what the currency implications are. I mean, what does it mean for a currency that doesn't have a nation state or doesn't have a sort of sovereign sponsor, and what are the implications there? And again, it goes back to the same thing. When it gets important, people start to care. When people start to care, the discussion really begins.
Yeah.
Alan, how would SWIFT handle Bitcoin?
I think I'm very much with you on this one. I think from a design architecture point of view, I think the Bitcoin approach, whether you call it Bitcoin or something else, there will be others, by the way, I'm sure, using the same sort of approach to market is a good thing. But again, I mean, I think the more it will be spread over in different markets, the more regulators, governments will start actually influencing this, or at least controlling what's the way it's being done. But frankly, if you look at the way it is done, it is a much more efficient way to dealing with currencies than the ones we have today, right?
Yeah.
That's the reality. If you look at from an architectural point of view, it's much more efficient.
And another irony is, Bitcoin got a bad reputation because of Silk Road and illicit activities transacting with Bitcoin. But fundamentally, with an open ledger, you could have nothing more transparent and traceable.
Yeah, but then from there you'll get to also the discussion about that's why governments will step in, or regulators, because you have all sort of issues around national debts, about sovereignty. I mean, currency is like the one thing that states have. Huh? It's like I have the dollar, I have the euro, whatever, but that's something that I have, and that shows the strength of your country or your people.
Partha, Bitcoin in India.
Yeah,
It could be the answer.
In terms of cost, what is the cost structure of a Bitcoin-like operations versus the hard currency method that we have? And if eventually productivity and the cost of transaction has to win over, Bitcoin has a place in the world. Yeah, and some of these will go through much problems as you have defined, because governments will try to hold. So I think of this not as a general answer to everything, but as a niche area, which will do in certain areas very well, while government will try to kind of control bits of it, which it wants to still have the green bucks and feel their money in the hand. So I think that will coexist, but there will be a place for something like Bitcoin, even in India.